I know what an outhouse smells like up close and personal. My grandparents had one, and I remember the rough wood, the spiders lurking in the corners, the occasional snake, and that smell, that unforgettable sun-baked smell that hits you the moment you open the door. And if that is still a reality for families in my lifetime, imagine what it was like in 1850 in New England when it was the only option available every single day. Rain, snow, January at midnight, August and 90-degree weather. Today, we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about what it was like pooping in the 1800s. You're welcome. But before we dive in, and diving in is not something I would recommend, let's get our terminology straight because the Victorians were nothing if not creative about avoiding the topic entirely. If someone in 1850 said they needed to see a man about a horse, they weren't shopping for livestock. If they needed to answer the call of nature or visit the necessary or retire for a moment, well, you know. And the facilities themselves had almost as many names: the privy, the necessary, the backhouse, the house of office, the little house, the jakes, the temple of ease. The temple of ease. I love that one. Very grand for what it actually was. And here's a good one. When President John Quincy Adams had one of the first indoor toilets installed in the White House, Quincy, briefly, became a popular euphemism, as in, "Excuse me, I need to go visit Quincy." The poor man never lived it down, and here I am bringing it up again after all this time. Sorry, not sorry. Now, here's something about the 1800s that we tend to forget. Everybody dealt with this every single day. Rich, poor, farmer, city dweller, mill worker, Brahmin banker on Beacon Hill, the President of the United States, your grandmother, everyone. There was no opting out. There was no modern plumbing to make it tidy and invisible. This was a fundamental daily reality of life, and how you dealt with it said a great deal about who you were and where you lived. So let's look at two very different worlds: the farm and the city. If you lived on a New England farm in the 1800s, you had an outhouse called the necessary, the privy, the backhouse, take your pick. It was located behind the house somewhere, far enough to keep the smell away from the kitchen, but close enough that you could actually get there. Or as the old joke went, too close in the summer, too far in the winter. And in January in New England, that distance mattered considerably. Now, the outhouse itself was simple. It's a wooden structure over a pit, a seat with one or two holes or more, one size for adults, one smaller for children, because even then, parents worried about their kids falling in. And that fear was completely justified. The hole looked like a portal to a very unpleasant underworld, and it smelled like one too. Speaking of which, now, the big question everyone always has is, what did you use for toilet paper? Well, you used whatever you had. Corn cobs were common. Imagine the scrape of a dried corn cob on the sensitive nether regions. Leaves in summer, but not poison ivy. Leaves of three, leave it be. Maybe old rags. And by mid-century, the Sears and Montgomery Ward catalogs had arrived, which served as double duty reading material and, well, the other thing. The Farmer's Almanac was especially prized because it came with a hole already punched in the corner so you could hang it on a nail. When the almanac briefly stopped including the hole, customers complained so loudly they brought it back. Priorities. Now, at night, nobody wanted to make that trip across the yard in the dark, especially in the winter months. Winters are long in New England, so long. So every bedroom had a chamber pot. And every morning, someone, usually not the person who enjoyed using it during the night, had the job of emptying it. That was your morning. Every morning, carrying your pot out to dump it in the outhouse. Oh, the glamour. Now, in my husband's family, they didn't have fancy chamber pots. They used Hawaiian punch cans. Each family member had their own personal Hawaiian punch can. And every morning you were responsible for taking your can down to the outhouse to empty it. Now, their outhouse was off the barn. Waste collected in this sturdy wooden box, you hope it's sturdy, about 6 feet by 4 feet. And when it got full, Grandpa Putnam would hook it up to the tractor and drag it across the field. It was simple, it was practical, it was not really glamorous, but it was part of life. But before the ultimate destination of your waste was reached, you had to get through the night. And on the coldest winter nights in that old New Hampshire farmhouse, the Hawaiian punch can would freeze solid. Let that sink in for a moment. Frozen pea in a can, not from concentrate. One winter morning, the boy who would one day be my husband decided that trudging out to the outhouse in the cold was more than he was willing to deal with. He had a better idea. He opened his bedroom window and emptied his Hawaiian punch can into the snow. Funny thing about snow, it's white. Pea is not. His mother noticed, and he did not do that again. Now, if farm life sounds unpleasant, let's talk about the city. Now, Boston in 1850 was a growing, bustling, ambitious city. It also, depending on the weather, sported a nearly unbearable stench. Because beneath those elegant streets and the fine brick buildings was a system of cesspools, pits of accumulated human waste simmering under the city, occasionally overflowing and seeping into the groundwater and leaking into the wells people drank from. Now, every night, men called night soil men, there's a job, came through the city to empty those cesspools. It was dangerous, it was filthy, it was miserable work. They carried the waste away, called night soil, and they spread it on farm fields outside the city, which I'm sure also smelled fantastic. This was technically recycling. Composting was not glamorous recycling by any means. My husband's grandfather, hooking that wooden box to his tractor and dragging it across the field, the night soil men of Boston were doing essentially the same job, just with horses and wagons instead of tractors, and on a considerably larger and smellier scale. And when the system failed, which it did regularly, the result was disease. We're talking dysentery, typhoid, cholera, or as people politely called it, the flux, the runs, the trots, the backdoor trots, the bowel complaint, intestinal disturbance, and my personal favorite, the summer complaint. Because in the heat of a New England summer with open cesspools and contaminated wells, digestive illness spiked dramatically. Everyone knew what summer complaint meant. Everyone had experienced it. The desperate sprint across the yard, the midnight race to the necessary. Summer complaint, which incidentally is also what we call tourists here in New England. The connection between human waste and disease wasn't fully understood yet. People believed in miasma theory, the idea that bad smells caused illness. They weren't entirely wrong about the smells, they just hadn't figured out the germs yet. But in 1850, a Boston bookseller turned reformer named Lemuel Shattuck published a landmark report on the sanitary condition of Massachusetts. What he found was shocking. Crowded cities, contaminated water, disease running rampant through poor neighborhoods, while wealthy families remained largely insulated. Something clearly had to change. And change it did, though perhaps not as quickly or equitably as one might hope. But enter the entrepreneurs. In 1857, a New York businessman named Joseph Gayetty, or Gayetty, as I like to call him, introduced what he called Gayetty's Medicated Paper, the first commercially sold toilet paper in America. Hooray! It was sold in flat sheets, infused with aloe, watermarked with his own name, which is an interesting choice, and marketed as a medical product to prevent hemorrhoids. You could buy it at the pharmacy. His tagline was, "The greatest necessity of the age." This was a significant step up from the corn cob, though given the price, most New England farm families weren't rushing to make the switch. Those corn cobs and empty cans remained in service. Now, around the same time, an English inventor named Henry Moule patented something called the earth closet, and it was a clever contraption. Instead of water, you pulled a handle and a measured amount of dry earth dropped down to cover the waste, very much like a modern composting toilet. The Earth Closet Company marketed these aggressively in America, especially in rural New England, where running water was still a distant dream. There was actually a genuine debate among sanitary reformers about which was better, the earth closet or the water closet. Now, the earth closet crowd had some reasonable arguments, but ultimately, the water closet won. The water closet, the flush toilet, was the prize. And in the 1870s and 1880s, wealthy New England families began installing them. High tank on the wall with a pull chain and that satisfying whoosh of water. If you had one, you were somebody. And if you didn't, and most people didn't, you were still making that long trip across the yard. Now, here's the thing. We tend to think of the outhouse as ancient history, something we left behind in the 19th century, but we didn't really. I mean, right here in Maine, in a town called Bryant Pond, about 30 minutes from where I'm sitting, there's a three-story outhouse attached to the back of the Jefferson Masonic Lodge. It was built in the 1800s. It's still standing. And next door, the Grange Hall has its own two-story outhouse. They didn't get a modern bathroom until the 1960s. Two multi-story outhouses, which, by the way, is a whole interesting story in itself, side by side in a Maine village within living memory. And of course, there are pit toilets at every state campground, porta potties at every outdoor concert, every construction site, every county fair in New England. We never really fully walked away from the concept. We just made it a little more portable, if not palatable. Which brings me to my final outhouse story, and I hope you'll share your outhouse stories with me in the comments. When I was a young girl teaching Sunday school at my country church, the church had what I can only describe as an indoor outhouse. It was on the backside of the building, of course, below the organ. There was no plumbing, the waste just went straight down to the ground below. And when I would help my little Sunday school girls in their little Sunday dresses up onto the seat in January, the cold air rising from below would make them gasp. And that was not in the 1850s. That was my life, and I'm not that old. And my husband's Hawaiian punch can that froze solid on winter nights and the yellow snow incident his mother never forgot, also not in the 1850s. That was in his life and on a New Hampshire farm in the 20th century. So when we talk about pooping in the 1800s, and I hope you will, we're not talking about ancient, unreachable history. We're talking about something that's still the daily reality for New England families well within living memory. The 19th century is closer than you think. Now, if you enjoyed this little journey through New England's more fragrant past, I'd love for you to subscribe to New England Time Travels. We dig into the real, the surprising, the occasionally smelly details of New England history. And if you're looking for some, reading material, I'll link my website below. I write historical fiction that mostly takes place in the 1800s, so you could be reading my books and it would be like you were pooping in the 1800s. You're welcome. Now, I will see you again somewhere in time.